Imagine being told your entire life that you would never make it, not because you lacked ambition, not because you lacked effort, but because the world looked at you and saw limitations before it saw potential. Now imagine carrying that judgment everywhere you go, into every audition, into every meeting, into every dream you dare to pursue. Long before the world knew the name Sylvester Stallone, he was just another struggling actor, trying to survive in an industry that had already decided he didn't belong. Casting directors dismissed him, producers ignored him, agents saw no commercial future in a young man whose speech was affected by a birth complication and whose appearance didn't fit Hollywood's standards. The strange thing is that failure didn't arrive suddenly. It arrived slowly. It came through hundreds of closed doors, through endless waiting rooms, through promises that never turned into opportunities, and eventually through something even more dangerous than rejection, the temptation to quit. What makes this story remarkable is not that Stallone became famous. Hollywood is full of success stories. What makes this story extraordinary is how close it came to never happening at all. Because there was a moment when his dream was hanging by a thread. A moment when survival seemed more important than ambition. A moment when the future creator of one of the most iconic films ever made was fighting battles that nobody would ever see. And yet, somewhere inside that uncertainty, an idea was beginning to take shape. Not a blockbuster, not a franchise, just a story. A story about a man nobody believed in, a man who wasn't supposed to win, a man who kept moving forward even when the odds seemed impossible. What Stallone didn't realize at the time was that he wasn't simply writing a screenplay. He was unknowingly writing his own future. In the years that followed, he would face decisions that most people never encounter, decisions where money, survival, pride, and belief would collide, decisions that would test whether his dream was truly worth fighting for. And perhaps the most surprising part of all is that the greatest obstacle standing between Sylvester Stallone and success was not poverty. It was not rejection. It was not Hollywood. It was the question that eventually confronts every person chasing an impossible dream. How much are you willing to sacrifice before you stop believing in yourself? To understand how Rocky was created, we first have to understand the young man the world had already counted out. Because before Rocky became a symbol of perseverance, Sylvester Stallone had to survive a life that was teaching him that perseverance might not be enough. When the world decided he had no future. Long before fame, awards, and red carpets, Sylvester Stallone entered the world under circumstances that would shape the rest of his life. During his birth, complications damaged nerves in part of his face. The result was permanent. One side of his mouth was affected, his speech sounded different, and his facial expressions never moved quite like everyone else's. Most people know him because of that unmistakable voice. Few realize that voice was born from an accident. As a child, he quickly learned that being different often comes with a price. Children can be cruel, adults can be dismissive, and society has a habit of deciding what someone is capable of before that person has the chance to prove otherwise. Stallone found himself constantly judged before he even spoke. Teachers underestimated him, classmates mocked him. Authority figures often assumed he would never accomplish anything significant. What made the situation even more difficult was that he didn't fit neatly into any category. He wasn't considered an exceptional student. He wasn't viewed as naturally gifted. He wasn't the person anyone pointed to as a future success story. In many ways, he grew up carrying an invisible label, not talented enough, not smart enough, not polished enough. The dangerous thing about labels is that eventually people begin to believe them. Many do. Many spend their entire lives living inside the limitations others place upon them. But something unusual was happening inside Stallone. Every rejection seemed to create a strange reaction. Instead of making him smaller, it made him more determined. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. Each criticism added another layer to a growing desire to prove people wrong. Years later, audiences would admire Rocky Balboa's refusal to stay down after being hit. What few realized was that this mindset didn't begin with Rocky. It began in Stallone's own childhood. Every insult became a punch, every dismissal became another round, every prediction of failure became fuel. The irony is almost unbelievable. The very characteristics Hollywood would later consider unique were the same characteristics that caused people to underestimate him when he was young. His voice, his face, his mannerisms. Everything that made him different eventually became part of what made him unforgettable. But none of that was visible yet. At this stage, there were no signs of future success. Only obstacles, only doubt. Only a young man entering adulthood with more reasons to quit than continue. And soon he would discover that the challenges of childhood were nothing compared to what awaited him in the real world, because the next battle would not be about fitting in. It would be about survival. Living on the edge of the American dream. As Sylvester Stallone entered adulthood, he carried something that millions of people carry into big cities every year: hope. Hope that somewhere beyond the crowded streets, beyond the endless competition, beyond the countless auditions, there was a place waiting for him. Hollywood sold a powerful dream: work hard, stay persistent, believe in yourself. Success will come. But reality was far less romantic. For every actor appearing on movie screens, there were thousands struggling in obscurity, chasing opportunities that rarely arrived. Stallone quickly became one of them. The auditions kept coming, the roles did not. Day after day, he found himself standing in lines filled with hopeful faces, each person competing for the same tiny chance. Producers looked at him, casting directors listened to him speak, and once again, many reached the same conclusion. Not the right fit, not marketable, not leading man material. Rejection was no longer an occasional setback. It became part of everyday life. What made the situation even harder was that dreams don't pay rent. Ambition doesn't buy food. Determination doesn't keep the lights on. Eventually, survival begins demanding answers. Money became increasingly scarce. The gap between what he wanted his life to be and what it actually was grew larger every month. Meanwhile, something painful was happening around him. He watched others succeed. Actors who had started alongside him began finding opportunities. Careers started moving. Doors opened. Lives changed. And Stallone remained stuck. This is one of the most dangerous moments in any journey. Not when you fail, but when you watch others succeed while you remain exactly where you started. That comparison can destroy belief faster than rejection ever could. Every success story around him became a silent question. Why them? Why not me? How much longer can this continue? Yet despite the frustration, Stallone became an observer. He studied the industry. He watched how opportunities appeared. He paid attention to what producers wanted. Most importantly, he began recognizing something that many dreamers never understand. The system was not waiting to discover him. Nobody was coming to rescue his career. Nobody was secretly preparing the perfect opportunity. If his future was going to change, he would eventually have to create the opportunity himself. At the time, however, that realization offered little comfort, because his financial situation continued getting worse. The dream that once felt exciting was beginning to feel expensive. Every day brought more uncertainty. Every month increased the pressure, and soon circumstances would push him closer to a breaking point than he had ever imagined possible, a point where survival and ambition would collide head-on. And when that moment arrived, Stallone would be forced to make a decision that most people never have the courage to face. The invisible power of obsession. Most people assume that extraordinary success comes from extraordinary confidence. That is rarely true. In reality, many of the world's greatest achievements were built by people who spent years doubting themselves. What separated them from everyone else was not confidence, it was persistence. And in Stallone's case, persistence eventually evolved into something much stronger. Obsession. Not the glamorous version people talk about after success arrives, the lonely version, the uncomfortable version, the kind that keeps someone moving forward when every logical reason says they should stop. By this point, Stallone had accumulated enough rejection to convince almost anyone that their dream was unrealistic. The industry had delivered its verdict repeatedly. He was not getting cast. He was not getting noticed. He was not getting the opportunities he believed he deserved, yet something inside him refused to accept the outcome. The fascinating part is that obsession often looks irrational from the outside. Friends see stubbornness, family sees risk, strangers see failure. Only the person living the dream can see the possibility hidden beneath the disappointment. While others measured progress through results, Stallone measured it through belief. He wasn't asking whether success had arrived. He was asking whether success was still possible. Those are very different questions. Most people quit because they stop seeing evidence. Obsessed people continue because they stop needing evidence. This mindset slowly changed the way he approached his future. Instead of waiting for permission, he began imagining alternatives. Instead of asking how to fit into Hollywood's system, he started wondering whether there was another way entirely. The shift was subtle but important. Every rejection was teaching him something. Not about acting, about control. The more he depended on other people to approve him, the more powerless he became. Casting directors controlled opportunities, producers controlled decisions, studios controlled careers. And as long as his future remained in their hands, he would always be vulnerable. Without realizing it, Stallone was approaching a breakthrough that had nothing to do with acting. He was beginning to understand ownership, the ability to create rather than wait, to build rather than request, to generate opportunity instead of chasing it. At first, these thoughts were little more than possibilities, ideas floating in the background, questions without answers. But they continued growing, because every failed audition pushed him toward the same conclusion. If nobody was willing to write the future he wanted, perhaps he would have to write it himself. The problem was that he still didn't know what that future looked like. He didn't have a story. He didn't have a character. He didn't have a plan. What he had was frustration, determination, and an obsession that refused to die. And then one night, while watching a sporting event that most people would forget within days, he witnessed something that would change everything. An ordinary evening would suddenly become the spark behind one of the most iconic stories ever told. And for the first time, all the struggle, rejection, and frustration would begin pointing in the same direction. The night that changed everything. History often creates the illusion that life-changing moments announce themselves in advance. They don't. Most arrive quietly, they look ordinary, they feel insignificant. And only years later do people realize they were witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. For Sylvester Stallone, that moment came on a night when millions of Americans were simply watching a boxing match. The event featured one of the most dominant athletes on the planet, Muhammad Ali. By that point, Ali wasn't just a champion. He was a global phenomenon. Fast, charismatic, intelligent, and seemingly unbeatable. Standing across from him was a fighter few people expected to matter. Chuck Wepner, an underdog, a long shot. The kind of opponent experts predicted would be defeated quickly. Most viewers assumed the fight would follow a familiar script. The champion would dominate. The challenger would fade away. The night would end exactly as expected. But something unexpected happened. Wepner refused to disappear. Round after round, he absorbed punishment and kept moving forward. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to compete. He certainly wasn't supposed to survive. Yet somehow he continued standing. For the audience, it was an entertaining fight. For Stallone, it was something else entirely. It was a revelation, because what captured his attention wasn't boxing. It was human nature. He wasn't watching a sport. He was watching a struggle. He was watching a man who had already lost in the eyes of the world continue fighting anyway. And suddenly, something connected. The fighter in the ring and the struggling actor sitting at home shared the same battle. Both were outsiders. Both were underestimated. Both were facing opponents far bigger than themselves. At that moment, Stallone saw something most people missed. The story was not about winning. The story was about proving you belonged. That distinction changed everything. Victory was not the emotional center of the fight. Respect was. The audience wasn't cheering because Wepner was dominating. They were cheering because he refused to surrender. The more Stallone thought about it, the more powerful the idea became. What if a story focused entirely on that feeling? What if the hero wasn't the strongest man in the room? What if he wasn't the most talented? What if he wasn't expected to win at all? What if the greatest achievement was simply earning the right to stand there? The concept began forming almost immediately. A fighter, an underdog, a man overlooked by society, someone searching not for a championship, but for dignity, for purpose, for proof that his life mattered. The beauty of the idea was that it reflected something universal. Most people will never step into a boxing ring, but everyone knows what it feels like to be underestimated. Everyone knows rejection. Everyone knows self-doubt. Everyone knows what it means to keep going when success feels impossibly far away. Without realizing it, Stallone had just found the emotional foundation of a story that would resonate around the world. But finding the idea was only the beginning. Now came the difficult part, turning inspiration into reality. Because an idea alone could not change his life. It had to become something real. And what happened next would test his determination more than anything he had faced before. Writing against time, hunger, and reality. The difference between a dream and a turning point is action. Millions of people experience inspiration. Very few do something with it. After watching that fight, Stallone could have done what most people do. He could have talked about the idea. He could have imagined what the story might become. He could have waited for the perfect moment. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He committed. What made this decision remarkable was the timing. His life was not stable. His career was not improving. His finances were not recovering. In fact, almost every practical aspect of his situation suggested that focusing on survival would be the smarter choice. Yet the idea refused to leave him alone. It followed him everywhere. The more he thought about it, the clearer the character became. Not a superhero, not a genius, not a champion. Just an ordinary man carrying extraordinary determination. A man who had spent years being overlooked. A man society had quietly stopped believing in. A man whose greatest battle wasn't in a boxing ring but inside his own mind. The truth was impossible to ignore. He wasn't creating a fictional character. He was translating pieces of his own life into a story. The loneliness, the frustration, the feeling of being dismissed before getting a chance, the fear that time was running out, all of it found its way onto the page. As he wrote, something unusual began happening. The screenplay stopped feeling like an opportunity. It started feeling like a necessity. Every scene became personal. Every struggle carried emotional weight. Every setback felt authentic because he had lived versions of it himself. This wasn't a writer inventing hardship. This was a man documenting emotions he understood intimately. The urgency intensified. Stallone sensed that this story represented more than a creative project. It represented leverage. Perhaps for the first time in years, he possessed something the industry could not immediately take away. An original idea, a character, a narrative, something that belonged to him. The significance of ownership cannot be overstated. Until now, his future had depended almost entirely on other people's decisions. Whether he worked depended on casting directors. Whether he advanced depended on producers. Whether he survived depended on opportunities that rarely appeared. Now, for the first time, he held something of value in his own hands, and that realization changed the way he viewed himself. He was no longer just an actor waiting to be selected. He was becoming a creator, someone capable of generating opportunity rather than chasing it. But there was still a brutal reality standing between the screenplay and success. Writing a script is one thing. Convincing Hollywood to care is another. Thousands of screenplays are written every year. Most are forgotten. Most never reach the people who matter. Most never become films. Stallone knew this. He understood that completing the script was not the finish line. It was merely the beginning of a much larger challenge. Soon, the screenplay would reach people with money, power, and influence. People who saw enormous potential in the story. People willing to offer him something he desperately needed. Something that could immediately solve many of his problems. And that offer would force him into the most important decision of his entire life. The offer that could have changed everything. When the screenplay finally began circulating through Hollywood, something unexpected happened. People paid attention. For years, Stallone had struggled to convince the industry that he was worth noticing. Auditions led nowhere. Opportunities disappeared. Doors stayed closed. Now, suddenly, those same doors were beginning to open. Executives read the script and recognized something powerful. The story worked. The characters felt real. The emotional core was undeniable. For the first time in a very long time, Stallone had something Hollywood wanted, and with that interest came something he had not seen much of during his career. Money, serious money. Offers started appearing. To an outsider, this should have been the happiest moment of his life. After all, wasn't this the goal? Wasn't success supposed to look exactly like this? But hidden inside those offers was a condition that transformed a dream opportunity into a painful dilemma. Hollywood wanted the screenplay. Hollywood did not want Stallone. The studios believed in Rocky. They did not believe in the unknown actor who had written him. Their logic seemed reasonable. The script had potential. The character had potential. But the lead role should be played by a proven star. Someone recognizable, someone marketable, someone who could attract audiences, someone other than Stallone. This is where many stories would end. Not because the opportunity was bad, because it was good, very good. Good enough to convince most people to compromise. Imagine standing in his position, years of financial struggle, years of rejection, years of uncertainty, and suddenly someone offers enough money to solve many of those problems. The rational decision seemed obvious. Sell the script, take the money, move forward. Most people would have accepted immediately. Many would have considered it a miracle, but Stallone saw something nobody else saw. The screenplay was not simply a product, it was a doorway. And once he sold it without himself attached to the project, that doorway might close forever. This wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even about acting. It was about identity. He had spent years listening to people tell him who he could not become. Now those same voices were effectively making the same argument again. The story is valuable. You are not. The script deserves a chance. You do not. For Stallone, that message felt familiar. Too familiar, because it echoed the same judgment he had been hearing since childhood. The world was once again separating his potential from his limitations, and once again, it was asking him to accept the separation. What made the situation so difficult was that there were no guarantees. If he rejected the offers, the future remained uncertain. The money could disappear. The opportunity could vanish. The industry could lose interest. Everything he had worked for could collapse. The risk was enormous, and that is what made the next decision extraordinary, because Stallone was about to choose something that seemed irrational to almost everyone around him, something that could either destroy his future completely or create a legacy that would outlive generations. The gamble was about to begin. The gamble. Nobody could understand. There are moments in life when logic and conviction move in opposite directions. Logic points toward safety. Conviction points toward uncertainty. And the further apart those paths become, the harder the decision gets. For Stallone, that moment had arrived. The offers on the table were real. The money was real. The chance to escape years of financial pressure was real. What wasn't real was certainty, because accepting the deal would mean giving away the one thing he believed mattered most, the chance to become Rocky. From the outside, his position appeared absurd. Industry professionals could not understand it. Friends questioned it. Observers shook their heads. How could someone with so little refuse so much? How could a struggling actor reject an opportunity people spend entire careers hoping to receive? The answer had nothing to do with confidence. In fact, Stallone still had doubts, plenty of them. He was not sitting in a room convinced he would become a star. He was not predicting awards. He was not imagining global fame. His reasoning was far simpler. If Rocky was going to exist, it had to be authentic. And nobody understood Rocky better than the man who had lived pieces of him. That belief became impossible to ignore. The script wasn't merely inspired by struggle, it was built from it. Every setback carried emotional truth. Every moment of perseverance reflected experiences Stallone knew personally. Removing himself from the story felt like removing its heartbeat. The more pressure he received, the clearer his decision became. He would not sell the screenplay unless he played the lead role. A condition that many people considered unrealistic. Some considered it reckless. Others considered it career suicide. Yet, this decision reveals something fascinating about extraordinary achievements. Often, the defining moment is not the creation of the opportunity, It is the refusal to compromise when the opportunity arrives. Many dreams disappear because people negotiate away the very thing that made the dream meaningful in the first place. Stallone refused to do that. He protected the vision. Not because success was guaranteed, because meaning was. Even if everything failed, he wanted to fail, pursuing what he actually believed, not someone else's version of it. The standoff continued. Executives pushed, Stallone resisted. Pressure increased. So did the stakes. Every passing day carried uncertainty. The screenplay could lose momentum. Interest could fade. Decision-makers could move on. Yet somehow, he held his ground. And eventually something remarkable happened. The studios began bending. Not completely, not comfortably, but enough. The impossible conversation slowly transformed into a possible agreement. The struggling actor who had spent years begging for opportunities was suddenly negotiating from a position of strength. Not because he possessed power, because he possessed leverage. And leverage comes from having something worth protecting. Soon, the deal would finally come together. The cameras would start rolling. The project would become real. But the greatest surprise was still ahead, because nobody, not the executives, not the critics, not even Stallone himself, fully understood what was about to happen when Rocky reached the world. A film was being made, but a movement was about to begin. When Rocky stopped being a movie, by the time production finally began, few people in Hollywood were predicting history. The budget was modest. The lead actor was largely unknown. The story centered on a boxer nobody had ever heard of. On paper, Rocky looked like a small film with limited expectations. Hollywood had seen countless projects come and go. Most disappeared without leaving a trace. There was no obvious reason to believe this one would be different. Yet something unusual was happening beneath the surface. The film was connecting with something far deeper than entertainment, because audiences were not simply watching Rocky Balboa. They were recognizing themselves. Think about it. Rocky wasn't the strongest fighter. He wasn't the smartest man in the room. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't destined for greatness. In fact, his life looked remarkably ordinary, and that was precisely the point. For decades, audiences had been taught to admire extraordinary people. Rocky invited them to admire an ordinary person doing something extraordinary. That distinction changed everything. Suddenly, factory workers saw themselves in him. Construction workers saw themselves in him. Single parents saw themselves in him. Dreamers saw themselves in him. Anyone who had ever been overlooked saw themselves in him. The story crossed boundaries because it wasn't really about boxing. Boxing was simply the stage. The real subject was dignity, the desire to matter, the refusal to allow circumstances to define identity. Every punch Rocky absorbed represented a setback people understood. Every time he got back up, reflected a decision people faced in their own lives. This emotional connection spread rapidly. Word of mouth grew. Theaters filled. Conversations multiplied. People weren't discussing technical filmmaking. They weren't debating cinematic theory. They were talking about how the movie made them feel. And feelings travel faster than marketing. The film's momentum became impossible to ignore. Critics paid attention. Audiences returned. The cultural impact expanded beyond expectations. What had started as a deeply personal story was becoming something universal. And perhaps the most fascinating part was that Rocky succeeded for the exact reason many experts had doubted it. Its authenticity, the imperfections, the vulnerability, the humanity. Everything that made the story different became its greatest strength. Audiences sensed the honesty. They felt it in the dialogue. They felt it in the performances. They felt it in the struggle. Because genuine stories possess a power that formulas cannot replicate. The world was no longer seeing Rocky as a fictional boxer. He had become a symbol of resilience, a symbol of persistence, a symbol of possibility. And at the center of it all stood Sylvester Stallone, the man who had once been told he wasn't good enough, the man Hollywood had doubted, the man who refused to surrender his vision. But success creates challenges of its own, because once a dream becomes reality, a new question emerges. What happens after the victory? What happens when the impossible goal you've chased for years is finally achieved? For Stallone, The next battle would not be about becoming successful. It would be about surviving success itself. The trap that appears after success. Most people spend their lives imagining what success feels like. They picture the applause, the recognition, the financial freedom, the moment when all the sacrifices finally make sense. What they rarely imagine is the pressure that arrives afterward. Because success solves many problems, it also creates entirely new ones. When Rocky exploded into a worldwide phenomenon, Sylvester Stallone experienced a transformation few human beings ever witness. One day he was fighting to be noticed. The next, the entire world knew his name. The contrast was staggering. For years, rejection had been his normal reality. Now admiration surrounded him. People who had ignored him wanted meetings. People who had doubted him wanted partnerships. People who had dismissed him suddenly wanted access. The external world had changed almost overnight. But internally, something more complicated was happening. The dream had been achieved. Now what? This is the hidden challenge of success. Goals provide direction. Once the goal is reached, direction can disappear. For years, Stallone's life had revolved around a single mission: get the movie made, play Rocky, prove he belonged. Now he had done all three. The mountain had been climbed, and standing at the top brought a realization few people discuss. Achievement does not eliminate uncertainty. It merely changes its shape. Instead of asking whether he would ever succeed, Stallone now faced a different question. Could he do it again? The world often assumes that success creates confidence. Sometimes it creates expectation. And expectations can become their own kind of burden. Every future project would now be compared to Rocky. Every performance would be measured against an iconic role. Every decision would carry greater consequences. The freedom of being unknown had vanished. Now the spotlight followed him everywhere. Many people struggle when success arrives because they become prisoners of their own breakthrough. They spend their lives trying to recreate the moment that changed everything. Stallone understood this danger. If he wanted longevity, he needed more than one victory. He needed adaptability. He needed resilience. He needed the ability to continue creating while the world watched. This required a completely different mindset than the one that had built Rocky. The first battle was about opportunity. The next battle was about sustainability. One demanded belief. The other demanded growth. And perhaps the most important lesson emerged during this period. Success is not a destination. It is an environment, a constantly changing landscape that requires new decisions, new risks, and new forms of courage. The qualities that helped Stallone survive obscurity were not enough on their own. He had to evolve, he had to learn. He had to prove that Rocky was not a lucky accident. That challenge would shape the rest of his career. But decades later, when people reflect on the story of Sylvester Stallone, they rarely focus on contracts, awards, or box office numbers. They remember something much deeper. Something that explains why Rocky still matters generations later. And that final lesson has very little to do with boxing. Rocky was never about boxing. If you remove the boxing ring, the gloves, the training montages, and the championship fight, something remarkable remains. The story still works. Because Rocky was never truly about sports. It was about something far more universal: identity. For most of his life, Sylvester Stallone lived under labels created by other people. Not talented enough, not attractive enough, not marketable enough, not likely to succeed. Those labels followed him through childhood, through auditions, through years of financial struggle, and through countless moments when giving up would have seemed reasonable. What makes his journey extraordinary is not that he escaped poverty. Many people have done that. It is not that he became famous. Many people have done that too. What makes his story unforgettable is that he refused to allow other people's opinions to become his reality. That is the hidden message inside Rocky. The film was never asking whether an underdog could become a champion. It was asking something deeper. Who gets to decide your limits? The world will always offer answers. Employers will, critics will, experts will, competitors will, sometimes even friends and family will. The temptation is to accept those answers as permanent truth. Rocky challenged that idea, not through speeches, not through theories, but through action. The character steps into an arena where nobody expects him to belong. Not because he is guaranteed to win, because he refuses to accept that he doesn't deserve the chance. That is why the story continues resonating decades later. Every generation discovers its own version of Rocky. A student struggling to believe in themselves, an entrepreneur facing repeated failure, a parent carrying responsibilities that feel overwhelming, an artist pursuing a vision nobody else understands. The details change. The battle remains the same, the fight between external judgment and internal belief. And perhaps that is why Stallone's greatest achievement was never the screenplay. It was never the movie. It was never the fame. His greatest achievement was demonstrating what can happen when conviction survives longer than doubt. Think about how different history could have been. One compromised decision, one moment of surrender, one acceptance of someone else's limitations. And Rocky might never have existed. The world would have lost one of its most enduring symbols of perseverance. But more importantly, Stallone would have lost the opportunity to become the person he was capable of becoming. That is the lesson hidden beneath every chapter of this story. The future is rarely built in dramatic moments. It is built in quiet decisions. The decision to continue, the decision to believe, the decision to protect a vision when nobody else can see it. Years before millions of people cheered for Rocky Balboa, there was a struggling actor fighting an invisible battle of his own. And in many ways, that was the real championship fight. Because before Rocky could inspire the world to keep moving forward, Sylvester Stallone first had to prove to himself that he would do the same. And that may be the most powerful victory of all.